Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. What would you do if you were accused of a crime you didn't commit? How would you feel if the very people sworn to protect you were the ones pointing the finger? What if the system designed to serve justice was the same system rigged against you? These are questions no one should have to answer, but for one man they became his reality. This is a story about power, prejudice, and the shocking moment when the tables turned. But before dive in, hit the like button, subscribe, comment, and hit the notification button to get notified whenever we drop a new video. It was a quiet evening in the small town of Crestwood, a place where everyone knew everyone, or so they thought. The streets were dimly lit, and the air carried a faint chill. A black SUV rolled to a stop at a red light. Inside, a man sat calmly, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt and a tailored suit, his tie slightly loosened after a long day. His name was Michael Langston, and he was the state's chief prosecutor, a man who had spent his career fighting for justice. But tonight he wasn't in a courtroom. He wasn't surrounded by colleagues or judges. Tonight he was just another black man driving through a predominantly white neighborhood. Suddenly, flashing blue and red lights filled his rearview mirror. Michael frowned. He hadn't been speeding. He hadn't run the light. He hadn't done anything wrong. But he knew better than to question it. He pulled over, his heart sinking as he rolled down his window. Two officers approached, their footsteps heavy against the pavement. The first officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut, shone a flashlight into Michael's face. The second officer, younger and leaner, stood slightly behind him, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "License and registration," the first officer barked, his tone sharp and condescending. Michael reached for his glove compartment, moving slowly to avoid any sudden movements. "Officer, can I ask why I was pulled over?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The officer smirked. "We got a call about a suspicious vehicle matching your description. Now hurry it up." Michael handed over his documents, his mind racing. A suspicious vehicle? He drove a black SUV, one of the most common cars on the road. But he knew better than to argue. He'd seen this play out too many times before, on the news, in the stories of friends, in the lives of strangers. The officer took the documents and walked back to his patrol car, leaving Michael sitting in silence. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally the officer returned, his partner trailing behind him. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered, his voice cold. Michael hesitated. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I said step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his hand now resting on his gun. Michael complied, his heart pounding as he stepped onto the pavement. He raised his hands slightly, a gesture of surrender. "Officer, I'm not sure what's going on, but I assure you, I haven't done anything wrong." The younger officer stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "We'll be the judge of that. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Michael's stomach dropped. "You're arresting me? For what?" "Resisting arrest," the first officer snapped. "Now turn around." Michael's mind raced. Resisting arrest? He hadn't resisted anything. But he knew arguing would only make things worse. He turned around, his hands trembling as the cold metal of the handcuffs clamped around his wrists. As the officers led him to the patrol car, Michael's thoughts turned to his wife, Angela, and their two young children. What would they think when they heard about this? What would his colleagues say? He was the state's chief prosecutor, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law. And yet, here he was, being treated like a criminal. But Michael wasn't just any man. He was a man who knew the system inside and out. A man who had spent years prosecuting corrupt officials, abusive officers, and those who thought they were above the law. And as he sat in the back of that patrol car, a fire ignited within him. This wasn't just about him. This was about every person who had ever been wrongfully accused, every life destroyed by prejudice, every voice silenced by injustice. The officers didn't know who he was. They didn't know the power he wielded. But they were about to find out. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Michael's mind was already working. He would play along for now. But when the time was right, he would expose them. He would make them regret the day they ever crossed paths with Michael Langston. And so the stage was set. A quiet evening in Crestwood had turned into a night that would change everything. But this was only the beginning. What would happen next? Would Michael be able to prove his innocence? Or would the system he had fought so hard to uphold fail him when he needed it most? The answers were coming. But for now, all Michael could do was wait. And so could we. The patrol car sped through the quiet streets of Crestwood, its sirens silent but its lights still flashing. Michael sat in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him, his mind racing. He stared out the window, watching the familiar streets blur past. He knew where they were going: the Crestwood police station. A place he had visited countless times, though never like this. The officers in the front seat exchanged a few words, their voices low and muffled. Michael couldn't make out what they were saying, but he didn't need to. He could guess. They were probably discussing how to spin this, how to justify their actions. He knew the playbook. Fabricate a story, plant evidence, intimidate the suspect into silence. It was a game they had played before and they were good at it. But Michael wasn't playing by their rules. The car pulled into the station parking lot, and the officers got out, opening the door for Michael. "Let's go," the first officer said, yanking him out of the car. Michael stumbled slightly but quickly regained his footing. He didn't say a word as they led him inside, his expression calm but his eyes sharp, taking in every detail. The station was quiet, with only a few officers milling about. It was late and most of the staff had gone home for the night. They brought him to a small interrogation room, its walls bare except for a two-way mirror and a single flickering fluorescent light. The officers uncuffed him and gestured for him to sit. "Wait here," the first officer said before leaving the room, slamming the door shut behind him. Michael sat down, his mind still racing. He knew what was coming next. They would try to intimidate him, to break him down. But he wasn't afraid. He had faced worse in his career: corrupt politicians, ruthless criminals, even death threats. This was nothing. A few minutes later, the door opened and a new officer walked in. He was older, with graying hair and a stern expression. He carried a folder under his arm and sat down across from Michael, placing the folder on the table. "Mr. Langston," the officer began, his voice calm but firm. "Do you know why you're here?" Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "I was hoping you could tell me." The officer opened the folder and pulled out a piece of paper. "We received a report of a stolen vehicle matching your description. A black SUV, license plate number." He glanced at the paper. XJ7-892. Michael raised an eyebrow. "That's not my license plate number." The officer ignored him. "The vehicle was reported stolen earlier this evening. The owner claims it was taken from their driveway." Michael shook his head. "I don't know what to tell you, officer. My car isn't stolen. I've had it for years. You can check the registration." The officer leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "We did. And according to our records, the vehicle registered to you was reported stolen 3 hours ago." Michael's heart skipped a beat. That wasn't possible. He had driven his car to work that morning, parked it in the courthouse garage, and driven it home that evening. There was no way it could have been stolen. Unless... Michael's eyes widened as the realization hit him. They had planted the report. They had falsified the records. They were setting him up. The officer leaned back in his chair, a smug smile on his face. "Looks like you've got some explaining to do, Mr. Langston." Michael clenched his fists under the table, his mind racing. He had to stay calm. He had to think. But before he could respond, the door opened, and the first officer walked in, holding a small plastic bag. "We found this in your car," he said, tossing the bag onto the table. Michael looked down and felt his stomach drop. Inside the bag was a small, clear plastic baggie filled with white powder. "Care to explain this?" the officer asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Michael stared at the bag, his mind reeling. This was bad. Really bad. They weren't just setting him up for car theft. They were setting him up for drug possession. But Michael wasn't just any suspect. He was the state's chief prosecutor. And he knew exactly how to handle this. He looked up at the officers, his expression calm but his eyes burning with determination. "I want to make a phone call." The officers exchanged a glance, then the older one nodded. "Fine. One call." Michael stood up, his mind already working. He knew who to call. Someone who could help him. Someone who could turn the tables on these corrupt officers. But as he reached for the phone, the first officer leaned in, his voice low and menacing. "Make it quick, Langston. You're not going anywhere." Michael ignored him, dialing the number from memory. The phone rang once, twice, then a familiar voice answered. "This is Detective Ramirez." Michael took a deep breath. "Ramirez, it's Michael. I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Ramirez's voice grew serious. "What's going on?" "I'm at the Crestwood police station," Michael said, his voice steady. "I've been arrested on false charges. They're trying to set me up." Another pause, then Ramirez spoke again. "I'm on my way. Don't say anything else until I get there." Michael hung up the phone, his heart pounding. He knew Ramirez would come through. He was one of the few honest cops left in the department, and he had worked with Michael on several high-profile cases. But as he sat back down, The officers exchanged a knowing glance. They didn't look worried. In fact, they looked almost amused. Would you call? The first officer asked, his tone mocking. Michael didn't respond. He just sat there, his mind racing. He had to stay calm. He had to wait for Ramirez. But as the minutes ticked by, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. And then the door opened again. But it wasn't Ramirez. It was someone else. Someone Michael hadn't expected. The man walked in, his face grim, his eyes cold. He was dressed in a suit, his badge hanging from his belt. Michael's heart sank as he recognized him. It was the chief of police. And he didn't look happy. The room fell silent as the chief of police stepped inside, his presence commanding immediate attention. His name was Chief Harold Grayson, a man with a reputation for being tough on crime and even tougher on those who crossed him. He was in his late 50s, with a stern face and a posture that screamed authority. His eyes locked onto Michael, and for a moment no one spoke. The two officers who had arrested Michael straightened up, their smug expressions replaced with a mix of respect and unease. It was clear they hadn't expected the chief to show up. Chief Grayson, the older officer said, his voice tinged with surprise. "We didn't expect you here tonight." Grayson ignored him, his gaze never leaving Michael. "Mr. Langston," he said, his voice low and measured. "I must say this is unexpected." Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but his mind racing. He knew Grayson well. They had crossed paths numerous times over the years, often clashing over cases and policies. Grayson was a man who believed in the absolute authority of the police, while Michael had always fought for accountability and justice. Their relationship had been tense, to say the least. "Chief Grayson," Michael replied, his tone even. "I'd say it's good to see you, but under the circumstances." Grayson's lips twitched, but he didn't smile. "I've just been informed of your arrest. Care to explain what's going on?" Before Michael could respond, the first officer stepped forward. "Chief, we pulled him over on a routine traffic stop. He matched the description of a suspect in a stolen vehicle case. When we searched his car, we found this." He held up the baggie of white powder, his voice dripping with false sincerity. Grayson took the baggie, examining it closely. "Is that so?" Michael clenched his fists under the table but kept his voice steady. "Chief, you know this is a setup. I've been framed." Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Framed? By whom?" "By them," Michael said, nodding toward the two officers. "They pulled me over for no reason, planted that evidence, and falsified a stolen vehicle report. This is about power, not justice." The room fell silent again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Grayson's expression was unreadable as he stared at Michael, then at the officers, then back at Michael. Finally he spoke. "This is a serious accusation, Mr. Langston. Do you have any proof?" Michael hesitated. He didn't have proof, not yet. But he knew how the system worked. He knew how to find it. "Not yet," he admitted. "But I will." Grayson nodded slowly, his expression still unreadable. "I see." The first officer stepped forward again, his voice eager. "Chief, we followed protocol. We had probable cause to pull him over, and the evidence speaks for itself. He's just trying to—" Grayson held up a hand, silencing him. "I'll handle this." The officer stepped back, his face flushing with embarrassment. Grayson turned to Michael, his gaze piercing. "Mr. Langston," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm going to give you one chance to come clean. Admit to what you've done and we can make this go away. But if you insist on playing games—" He trailed off, letting the threat hang in the air. Michael met his gaze, his expression unwavering. "I have nothing to admit, Chief. I'm innocent." Grayson studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Very well." He turned to the officers. "Release him." The officers stared at him, stunned. "Chief, we can't just—" "I said release him," Grayson repeated, his voice sharp. The officers exchanged a glance, then reluctantly uncuffed Michael. He rubbed his wrists, his mind still racing. He didn't trust Grayson, not for a second. This wasn't over. Grayson turned back to Michael, his expression grim. "This isn't a favor, Langston. Consider it a warning. You're playing a dangerous game, and if you're not careful, you're going to lose." Michael stood up, his eyes locked on Grayson's. "I've been playing this game for a long time, Chief. And I don't plan on losing." Grayson's lips twitched again, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Michael alone with the two officers. The first officer glared at Michael, his voice low and menacing. "This isn't over, Langston. You may have gotten lucky this time, but next time—" Michael didn't wait for him to finish. He turned and walked out of the room, his mind already working. He knew this wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. As he stepped out of the police station and into the cool night air, Michael took a deep breath. He had a lot to do and not much time to do it. He needed evidence. He needed allies. And most of all, he needed to expose the corruption that had nearly destroyed him. But as he walked to his car, a sense of unease settled over him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the dark streets. There was no one there. Or so he thought. The drive home was a blur. Michael's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he navigated the quiet streets of Crestwood. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, each one more urgent than the last. He needed to act fast. He needed to gather evidence, reach out to his contacts, and figure out who was behind this. But most of all, he needed to protect his family. As he pulled into his driveway, the sight of his home brought a small measure of comfort. It was a modest house, nestled in a quiet neighborhood, with a well-kept lawn and a porch light that always stayed on. Inside, his wife, Angela, and their 2 children were waiting for him. They had no idea what had just happened, and Michael intended to keep it that way for now. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before stepping out of the car. As he walked to the front door, he noticed a shadow move near the side of the house. His heart skipped a beat and he froze, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm but tinged with unease. There was no response. Michael hesitated, then reached into his pocket for his phone. He dialed a number, his eyes never leaving the shadow. Ramirez, the detective, answered on the first ring. "It's Michael," he said, his voice low. "I think someone's watching my house." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I'm on my way. Stay inside and don't engage." Michael hung up and quickly unlocked the front door, stepping inside and locking it behind him. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. He peeked through the blinds, his eyes scanning the yard, but he saw nothing. "Michael?" Angela's voice came from the hallway. She stepped into the living room, her face etched with concern. "Is everything okay? You look pale." Michael forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's fine. Just a long day at work." Angela studied him for a moment, her brow furrowed. "Are you sure? You seem off." Michael walked over to her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'm sure. Don't worry about me." Before she could press further, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway caught their attention. Michael glanced out the window and saw Ramirez's unmarked police car. "I'll be right back," he said, giving Angela a quick kiss on the forehead before heading outside. Ramirez was already out of the car, his eyes scanning the area as Michael approached. "You okay?" he asked, his tone serious. "I'm fine," Michael replied. "But I don't think this is over." Ramirez nodded. "I've been digging into those officers who arrested you. Their records are spotty to say the least. Multiple complaints of misconduct, but nothing ever sticks. It's like they're untouchable." Michael frowned. "That doesn't surprise me. But we need more than just complaints. We need hard evidence." Ramirez hesitated, then lowered his voice. "There's something else. I've been hearing whispers about a group within the department. A secret clique of officers who operate outside the law. They call themselves the Shield." Michael's eyes narrowed. "The Shield?" Ramirez nodded. "They're rumored to be involved in everything from evidence tampering to extortion. If they're behind this, we're dealing with something much bigger than a couple of rogue cops." Michael's mind raced. This was worse than he thought. If the Shield was real, then the corruption ran deep, deeper than he had imagined. "We need to expose them," Michael said, his voice firm. "But we have to be careful. If they find out we're on to them..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Ramirez knew the risks as well as he did. "I'll keep digging," Ramirez said. "But you need to lay low for a while. If they're watching you, they'll be looking for any excuse to take you down." Michael nodded, though the idea of sitting back didn't sit well with him. He wasn't the type to wait for things to happen. He was a man of action and he hated feeling powerless. As Ramirez drove away, Michael stood in the driveway, his mind racing. He knew what he had to do. He needed to gather evidence, build a case, and expose the Shield for what they were. But he couldn't do it alone. He pulled out his phone and dialed another number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Michael? It's late. What's going on?" It was his old friend and former colleague, Evelyn Carter. She was a brilliant defense attorney with a reputation for taking on impossible cases. If anyone could help him, it was her. "Evelyn," Michael said, his voice steady. "I need your help. I'm in trouble." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Evelyn's voice grew serious. "Tell me everything." And so Michael did. He laid out the events of the night, from the traffic stop to the confrontation with Chief Grayson. He told her about the shield and the whispers of corruption within the department. And he told her about the shadow he had seen outside his house. When he finished, Evelyn was silent for a moment. Then she spoke, her voice firm. "I'll be on the first flight out. In the meantime, don't do anything reckless. We'll figure this out together." Michael hung up the phone, a small measure of relief washing over him. He wasn't alone. He had allies. And together they would expose the truth. But as he turned to go back inside, a sudden noise caught his attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down his spine. It was the sound of footsteps moving quickly through the darkness. Michael spun around, his eyes scanning the yard. But once again there was no one there. Or so he thought. The sound of footsteps faded into the night, leaving Michael standing alone in his driveway, his heart pounding. He strained his ears, listening for any sign of movement, but the night was silent once more. Still, the unease lingered, a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. Someone had been there. Someone had been watching him. He hurried back inside, locking the door behind him and double-checking the windows. Angela was in the kitchen, pouring herself a cup of tea. She looked up as he entered, her expression softening with concern. "Michael, what's going on?" she asked, her voice gentle but insistent. "You've been acting strange all night." Michael hesitated, torn between his instinct to protect her and the need to be honest. He couldn't keep her in the dark forever. She deserved to know the truth. He sat down at the kitchen table, motioning for her to join him. "Angela, something happened tonight. Something bad." Her eyes widened and she set her tea down, taking a seat across from him. "What is it?" Michael took a deep breath, then told her everything. The traffic stop, the false accusations, the planted evidence, and the shadow outside their home. He left out the details about the shield. He didn't want to scare her more than necessary, but he made it clear that they were dealing with something dangerous. Angela listened in silence, her face pale but composed. When he finished, she reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "Michael, this is insane," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But we'll get through it. Together." He squeezed her hand, grateful for her strength. "I've already called Evelyn. She's flying in tomorrow to help. And Ramirez is looking into things on his end. We'll figure this out." Angela nodded, though her eyes still held a flicker of fear. "What about the kids? Are they in danger?" Michael's chest tightened at the thought. His children, Sophia, age 8, and Elijah, age 5, were his world. The idea of them being caught up in this nightmare was unbearable. "I'll make sure they're safe," he said firmly. "I'll hire extra security if I have to. But for now we need to act normal. We can't let them know anything's wrong." Angela nodded again, though her grip on his hand tightened. "Okay. But promise me you'll be careful, Michael. I can't lose you." He leaned across the table, kissing her forehead. "I promise." The rest of the night passed in a blur. Michael barely slept, his mind racing with plans and possibilities. By the time the sun rose, he was already up, dressed, and ready to face the day. Evelyn arrived mid-morning, her sharp eyes and no-nonsense demeanor a welcome sight. She was in her early 40s, with a sleek bob of dark hair and a wardrobe that screamed power. She hugged Michael tightly before getting straight to business. "Tell me everything," she said, sitting down at the kitchen table with a notebook and pen. "And don't leave anything out." Michael did as she asked, recounting the events of the past 24 hours in detail. Evelyn listened intently, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "This is bad," she said when he finished. "But not unsalvageable. We need to gather evidence, hard evidence, and build a case. If the shield is as powerful as Ramirez says, we'll need to be meticulous." Michael nodded. "Where do we start?" Evelyn tapped her pen against the table, thinking. "We start with the officers who arrested you. If we can prove they planted evidence or falsified reports, we can use that to expose the rest. But we'll need to move quickly. If they suspect we're onto them, they'll cover their tracks." Michael agreed, and the two of them spent the next few hours strategizing. By the time they finished, they had a plan, a risky one, but a plan nonetheless. As Evelyn gathered her things to leave, she turned to Michael, her expression serious. "One more thing. You need to be careful, Michael. These people play dirty. If they think you're a threat, they won't hesitate to take you out." Michael nodded, though the weight of her words settled heavily on his shoulders. "I know." After Evelyn left, Michael decided to take a walk to clear his head. He needed to think, to process everything that had happened. But as he stepped outside, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Parked across the street was a black sedan with tinted windows. It hadn't been there earlier. Michael's heart raced as he walked toward it, his eyes locked on the driver's side. As he got closer, the engine roared to life and the car sped off, disappearing around the corner. Michael stood there, his fists clenched, his mind racing. They were watching him. They were always watching him. But he wasn't going to let them win. The black sedan's tires screeched as it rounded the corner, leaving Michael standing in the middle of the street, his heart pounding. He stared after it, his mind racing. Whoever was in that car wasn't just watching him. They were sending a message that said, "We're here. We're watching. And we're not going anywhere." Michael clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. He wasn't going to let them intimidate him. He wasn't going to back down. But he also knew he couldn't face this alone. He pulled out his phone and dialed Ramirez. The detective answered on the second ring. "Michael," Ramirez said, his voice tense. "What's going on?" "I just had a run-in with a black sedan," Michael said, his eyes still scanning the street. "Tinted windows. They were parked outside my house, watching me. When I approached, they took off." Ramirez cursed under his breath. "Did you get the license plate?" "No," Michael admitted. "It happened too fast." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Ramirez spoke again. "I'll put out an APB on the car. In the meantime, you need to stay vigilant. If they're bold enough to show up at your house, they're not playing around." "I know," Michael said. "But I'm not going to sit back and wait for them to make the next move. We need to strike first." Ramirez hesitated. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need to dig deeper into the shield," Michael said. "If we can find even one member willing to talk, it could blow this whole thing wide open." Ramirez sighed. "It's risky, Michael. These people are dangerous. If they find out we're poking around—" "I know the risks," Michael interrupted. "But we don't have a choice. If we don't stop them, who will?" There was another pause, then Ramirez relented. "All right. I'll see what I can find. But be careful, Michael. These people don't mess around." Michael hung up the phone, his mind already racing. He needed to act fast, but he also needed to be smart. He couldn't afford any mistakes. He headed back inside, where Angela was waiting in the living room. She looked up as he entered, her face pale with worry. "Michael, what's going on?" she asked, her voice trembling. He sat down beside her, taking her hand in his. "Someone was watching the house. A black sedan with tinted windows. They took off when I approached." Angela's eyes widened in fear. "Michael, this is getting out of hand. We need to go to the authorities. We need to." "We are the authorities," Michael interrupted gently. "And right now, the people we're up against are the ones who are supposed to protect us. That's why we have to handle this ourselves." Angela stared at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "What can I do to help?" Michael hesitated. He didn't want to involve her any more than he already had, but he also knew he couldn't do this alone. "Keep an eye on the kids," he said finally. "Make sure they're safe. And if you see anything at all, call me immediately." Angela nodded, though her grip on his hand tightened. "Promise me you'll be careful, Michael? I can't lose you." He leaned over, kissing her forehead. "I promise." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Michael spent hours on the phone, reaching out to contacts, gathering information, and piecing together what he could about the shield. It was slow, painstaking work, but by evening he had a lead. One of his sources, a former cop who had left the force under suspicious circumstances, had mentioned a name: Officer Daniel Reeves. According to the source, Reeves was rumored to be a low-level member of the shield. If Michael could get to him, he might be able to get the information he needed. But there was a catch. Reeves was currently on administrative leave, pending an investigation into alleged misconduct. He was lying low and no one knew where he was. Michael knew it was a long shot, but it was the best lead he had. He called Ramirez, filling him in on what he'd learned. "Reeves?" Ramirez said, his tone skeptical. "I've heard the name, but I don't know much about him. If he's involved with the shield, he's not going to be easy to find." "I know," Michael said. "But it's a start. Can you help me track him down?" Ramirez hesitated, then sighed. "I'll see what I can do. But Michael, be careful. If the shield finds out you're looking for Reeves, they'll come after you." "I know," Michael said again. "But I don't have a choice." He hung up the phone, his mind racing. He needed to find Reeves and he needed to do it fast. But as he sat there, staring at the notes he'd gathered, a sudden noise caught his attention. It was the sound of glass breaking. Michael froze, his heart pounding. He grabbed his phone and crept toward the window, peering out into the darkness. At first he saw nothing. Then a shadow moved near the side of the house. Someone was out there. Michael's heart pounded as he crouched by the window, his eyes locked on the shadow moving near the side of the house. He gripped his phone tightly, his mind racing. Should he call the police? No, he couldn't trust them. Not after everything that had happened. He glanced over his shoulder, making sure Angela and the kids were still upstairs. He couldn't risk them getting caught in the crossfire. The shadow moved again, closer this time. Michael could make out the outline of a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dark hoodie. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide anymore. Michael's instincts kicked in. He grabbed a baseball bat from the corner of the room and crept toward the back door, his movements slow and deliberate. He needed to confront this intruder, but he also needed to be smart about it. As he reached the door, he took a deep breath, then flung it open, stepping outside with the bat raised. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice firm but tinged with anger. The figure froze, then slowly raised their hands. "Easy, Langston. It's me." The voice was familiar, but it took Michael a moment to place it. Then it hit him. "Reeves?" he said, lowering the bat slightly. The figure stepped into the light, pulling back his hood to reveal a face Michael recognized from the photos he'd seen earlier. Officer Daniel Reeves. He looked rough, his face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and his clothes were disheveled. "Yeah, it's me," Reeves said, his voice shaky. "I need your help." Michael stared at him, his mind racing. This was the man he'd been trying to find. The man who might hold the key to exposing the shield. And now here he was, standing in Michael's backyard. "What are you doing here?" Michael asked, his tone cautious. Reeves glanced over his shoulder, his eyes darting nervously. "They're after me. The shield. They know I've been talking. They know I want out." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Why come to me?" "Because you're the only one who can help me," Reeves said, his voice desperate. "You're the chief prosecutor. If anyone can take them down, it's you." Michael studied him for a moment, weighing his options. He didn't trust Reeves, not yet, but he also knew this might be his only chance to get the information he needed. "All right," he said finally. "Come inside." "But if this is some kind of setup." "It's not," Reeves interrupted, his voice pleading. "I swear I just want out." Michael nodded, then stepped aside, letting Reeves into the house. He led him to the kitchen, where Angela was waiting, her face pale with worry. "Angela, this is Daniel Reeves," Michael said, his tone calm but firm. "He's going to help us." Angela nodded, though her eyes were filled with fear. She didn't say anything, just stood there, clutching her phone like a lifeline. Michael turned back to Reeves. "Start talking. What do you know about the shield?" Reeves took a deep breath, then began to speak. "It's not just a few bad cops. It's a network. They've got people everywhere, in the department, in the courts, even in City Hall. They control everything. And if you cross them..." He trailed off, his eyes darkening. "What do they want?" Michael asked, his voice steady. "Power," Reeves said simply. "They want to control the city. And they'll do whatever it takes to keep it that way." Michael's mind raced. This was bigger than he'd thought. Much bigger. "Do you have proof?" he asked. "Names? Documents? Anything we can use?" Reeves hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I've got a flash drive. It's got everything, names, dates, transactions. But it's hidden. I couldn't risk carrying it with me." "Where is it?" Michael asked, his voice urgent. Reeves shook his head. "I'll tell you, but not yet. I need your word first. Your word that you'll protect me?" Michael stared at him, his jaw tightening. He didn't like making promises he wasn't sure he could keep, but he also knew he didn't have a choice. "You have my word," he said finally. "But if you're lying to me..." "I'm not," Reeves interrupted, his voice firm. "I swear I'm not." Michael nodded, though the unease in his chest didn't go away. He turned to Angela, who was still standing in the corner, her face pale. "Angela, take the kids and go to your sister's house," he said, his tone firm. "Stay there until I call you." Angela hesitated, then nodded. "Be careful, Michael." "I will," he promised. As Angela hurried upstairs to pack, Michael turned back to Reeves. "We need to move fast. If the shield knows you're here, they'll come after us." Reeves nodded, his expression grim. "I know. But there's one more thing you need to know." "What?" Michael asked, his eyes narrowing. Reeves hesitated, then spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've got someone on the inside. Someone close to you?" Michael's blood ran cold. "Oh." Before Reeves could answer, a loud crash came from the front of the house. Michael spun around, his heart pounding. Someone was breaking in. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the house, followed by heavy footsteps. Michael's heart raced as he grabbed the baseball bat, his eyes darting toward the front door. "Stay here," he hissed at Reeves, who nodded, his face pale with fear. Michael crept toward the living room, his grip tightening on the bat. The intruders were inside now, he could hear them moving, their voices low and urgent. Find him, one of them growled. He's here somewhere. Michael's mind raced. He needed to protect his family. He needed to protect Reeves. But he was outnumbered and outgunned. He peeked around the corner, his eyes scanning the room. Two men stood in the hallway, dressed in black and armed with handguns. They were searching the house, their movements quick and efficient. Michael took a deep breath, then stepped into the open, raising the bat. "Get out of my house," he shouted, his voice firm but trembling with anger. The men spun around, their guns trained on him. For a moment no one moved. Then one of them smirked. "Langston," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "We've been looking for you." Michael's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. "Who sent you?" "The Shield." The man's smirk widened. "You're smarter than you look. But it doesn't matter. You're not walking out of here alive." Before Michael could respond, a loud crash came from the kitchen. He glanced over his shoulder just in time to see Reeves burst into the room, wielding a frying pan. "Leave him alone," Reeves shouted, his voice shaking but determined. The intruders turned their attention to Reeves and Michael saw his chance. He swung the bat with all his strength, hitting the first man in the side of the head. The man crumpled to the ground, his gun clattering across the floor. The second man spun around, firing a shot that missed Michael by inches. Michael ducked, his heart racing as he scrambled for cover. Reeves charged at the second man, swinging the frying pan wildly. The man dodged, but Reeves managed to knock the gun out of his hand. Michael didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, tackling the man to the ground. They struggled, rolling across the floor until Michael managed to pin him down. "Who sent you?" Michael demanded, his voice fierce. The man glared at him, his lips curling into a sneer. "You'll find out soon enough." Before Michael could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. The man's eyes widened and he shoved Michael off him, scrambling to his feet. "This isn't over," he spat, then turned and ran, dragging his unconscious partner with him. Michael didn't chase them. He stayed on the floor, his chest heaving, his mind racing. Reeves stood nearby, still clutching the frying pan, his face pale. "They're not going to stop," he said, his voice trembling. "They'll keep coming until they get what they want." Michael nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. The sirens were getting closer, and he knew the police would be here any minute. But he couldn't trust them. Not after everything that had happened. He turned to Reeves, his expression grim. "We need to get out of here. Now." Reeves nodded, though his eyes were filled with fear. "Where are we going?" Michael didn't answer. He grabbed his phone and dialed Ramirez. The detective answered on the first ring. "Michael, what's going on?" Ramirez asked, his voice tense. "They're here," Michael said, his voice low and urgent. "The Shield. They just tried to kill me?" Ramirez cursed under his breath. "Where are you?" "At my house," Michael said. "But I can't stay here. I need a safe place to go." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Ramirez spoke again. "I know a place. It's off the grid. Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th and Main. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Michael nodded, though his heart was still racing. "All right. But hurry." He hung up the phone and turned to Reeves. "We're leaving. Now." Reeves didn't argue. He followed Michael to the garage, where they quickly got into Michael's car. As they pulled out of the driveway, Michael glanced back at the house, his chest tightening. Angela and the kids were safe, he'd made sure of that. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The drive to the warehouse was tense and silent. Reeves sat in the passenger seat, his eyes darting nervously as he scanned the streets. Michael kept his focus on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. When they finally arrived, Ramirez was waiting for them, his face grim. He led them inside the warehouse, which was dimly lit and filled with old machinery. "This is the best I could do on short notice," Ramirez said, his voice low. "It's not much, but it's safe." Michael nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He turned to Reeves, his expression serious. "You said you had proof. Where is it?" Reeves hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. "It's all here. Names, dates, everything. But you need to be careful. If they find out you have this..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Michael knew the risks. He took the flash drive, his mind racing. This was it. This was the evidence he needed to expose the Shield. But he also knew it wasn't going to be easy. As he stared at the flash drive, a sudden noise caught his attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down his spine. It was the sound of footsteps moving quickly through the darkness. Michael spun around, his eyes scanning the warehouse. But there was no one there. Or so he thought. The sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, faint but unmistakable. Michael's heart raced as he scanned the dimly lit space, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. Ramirez and Reeves stood beside him, their faces tense, their bodies coiled like springs. "Did you hear that?" Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. Ramirez nodded, his hand instinctively moving to his holstered gun. "Stay behind me," he said, his tone firm. The three of them moved cautiously through the warehouse, their footsteps muffled by the concrete floor. The sound had come from the far corner, near a stack of old crates. As they approached, Michael's pulse quickened. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from behind the crates, their hands raised in surrender. "Don't shoot," the figure said, their voice trembling. Michael squinted, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. It was a woman young, with short dark hair and a nervous expression. She looked familiar, but Michael couldn't place her. "Who are you?" Ramirez demanded, his gun still trained on her. "My name is Claire," the woman said, her voice shaky. "Claire Bennett. I'm a reporter." Michael's eyes widened. Claire Bennett. He'd heard the name before. She was an investigative journalist who had made a name for herself by exposing corruption in local government. "What are you doing here?" Michael asked, his tone cautious. Claire lowered her hands slightly, her eyes darting between the three men. "I've been investigating the Shield for months. I heard you were looking into them, so I tracked you down. I want to help." Michael exchanged a glance with Ramirez, who still looked skeptical. "How do we know we can trust you?" Claire hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. "This is everything I've gathered so far. Names, dates, bank records. It's not enough to take them down, but it's a start." Michael took the folder, flipping through the documents quickly. His eyes widened as he recognized some of the names: high-ranking officials, judges, even a city council member. "This is incredible," he said, his voice filled with awe. Claire nodded, her expression serious. "I've been working on this for a long time. But I can't do it alone. I need your help." Michael looked at Ramirez, who finally lowered his gun. "All right," Ramirez said, his tone grudging. "But if this is some kind of setup..." "It's not," Claire interrupted, her voice firm. "I want to take them down as much as you do." Michael nodded, though his mind was still racing. This was a turning point. With Claire's evidence and Reeves's flash drive, they finally had a chance to expose the Shield. But he also knew they were running out of time. "We need to move fast," Michael said, his voice urgent. "If the Shield finds out we have this, they'll come after us with everything they've got." Claire nodded, her expression determined. "I got a safe house. It's off the grid. We can work from there." Michael hesitated, then turned to Ramirez. "What do you think?" Ramirez sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't like it, but we don't have a choice. We need to get out of here before they find us." Michael nodded, then turned to Reeves. "You're coming with us." Reeves looked nervous, but he didn't argue. "All right. But if this goes south..." "It won't," Michael said firmly. "We're going to take them down. Together." The four of them left the warehouse, piling into Michael's car. Claire gave him directions to the safe house, which was located on the outskirts of the city. The drive was tense and silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. When they finally arrived, Michael was surprised by how ordinary the safe house looked. It was a small, unassuming house nestled in a quiet neighborhood. But as they stepped inside, he realized it was anything but ordinary. The walls were lined with maps, photos, and documents, all connected by a web of red string. It looked like something out of a crime thriller. "This is where I've been working," Claire said, her voice tinged with pride. "It's not much, but it's secure." Michael nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He turned to Reeves, his expression serious. "You said the Shield has someone on the inside. Someone close to me. Who is it?" Reeves hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. "I don't know their name. But they're high up. They've been feeding the Shield information for years." Michael's stomach churned. Someone close to him. Someone he trusted. The thought made him sick. Before he could press further, Claire interrupted. "We need to focus. We've got a lot of work to do." Michael nodded, though the unease in his chest didn't go away. He knew they were running out of time. The Shield was closing in and they needed to act fast. As they began to piece together the evidence, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced out the window, his eyes scanning the quiet street. At first he saw nothing. Then a shadow moved near the edge of the property. Michael's heart skipped a beat. They weren't alone. Michael's heart pounded as he stared out the window, his eyes locked on the shadow moving near the edge of the property. He turned to the others, his voice low and urgent. "We've got company." Ramirez was on his feet in an instant, his hand moving to his gun. Claire and Reeves exchanged a nervous glance, their faces pale. What do we do? Claire asked, her voice trembling. Michael's mind raced. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they couldn't just sit there and wait for the shield to make their move. We need to get out of here, Michael said, his tone firm. Now. Ramirez nodded, his expression grim. I'll cover the back. You take the front. Michael didn't argue. He grabbed the flash drive and the folder of documents, shoving them into his bag. Stay close, he said to Claire and Reeves. And don't stop for anything. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Michael led the way, his heart pounding as he approached the front door. He peeked through the window, his eyes scanning the street. At first he saw nothing. Then a black SUV pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Michael's stomach dropped. They're here. Before he could react, the sound of shattering glass came from the back of the house. Ramirez cursed, his voice echoing through the hallway. They're inside, he shouted. Michael didn't hesitate. He flung open the front door, ushering Claire and Reeves outside. Run, he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. They took off down the street, their footsteps pounding against the pavement. Michael glanced over his shoulder, his heart racing as he saw figures emerging from the house. Keep going, he shouted, pushing Claire and Reeves ahead of him. They turned a corner, ducking into an alleyway. Michael's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. They couldn't keep running forever. They needed a place to hide. This way, Claire said, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward a nearby building. They slipped inside, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The building was dark and empty, its walls lined with old boxes and machinery. What is this place? Michael asked, his voice low. An old factory, Claire replied, her voice shaky. It's abandoned. They won't think to look here. Michael nodded, though his mind was still racing. He turned to Reeves, his expression serious. You said the shield has someone on the inside. Someone close to me. Who is it? Reeves hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. I don't know their name. But they're high up. They've been feeding the shield information for years. Michael's stomach churned. Someone close to him. Someone he trusted. The thought made him sick. Before he could press further, the sound of footsteps echoed through the building. Michael's heart skipped a beat as he realized they weren't alone. They're here, Claire whispered, her voice filled with fear. Michael's mind raced. They were trapped. They couldn't fight and they couldn't run. But he wasn't going to give up. Not now. He turned to Ramirez, his expression grim. We need to make a stand. Ramirez nodded, his jaw tightening. I'm with you. Michael turned to Claire and Reeves, his voice firm. Stay here. Don't move. They nodded, their faces pale with fear. Michael and Ramirez crept toward the sound of footsteps, their hearts pounding. As they rounded a corner, they came face to face with two armed men. Michael didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, tackling the first man to the ground. Ramirez took on the second, his movements quick and efficient. The fight was brutal and chaotic. Michael's heart raced as he struggled to overpower his opponent, his mind focused on one thing: survival. Finally, he managed to pin the man down, his hands gripping the man's wrists tightly. Who sent you? He demanded, his voice fierce. The man glared at him, his lips curling into a sneer. You'll find out soon enough. Before Michael could respond, a loud crash came from behind him. He spun around, his heart racing as he saw more figures emerging from the shadows. They were surrounded. Michael's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. But before he could act, a voice echoed through the building. Enough. The voice was familiar, but it took Michael a moment to place it. Then it hit him. It was Chief Grayson. Michael's heart sank as Grayson stepped into the light, his expression grim. It's over, Langston, Grayson said, his voice cold. You've lost. Michael stared at him, his mind reeling. Grayson was the one on the inside. He was the one who had been feeding the shield information. What? Michael asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Grayson's lips twitched, but he didn't smile. Power, Langston. It's always been about power. Michael's stomach churned as the reality of the situation sank in. He had trusted Grayson. He had looked up to him. And now he realized that trust had been misplaced. But Michael wasn't going to give up. Not now. He glanced at Ramirez, who nodded, his expression grim. They were outnumbered, but they weren't out of options. As Grayson stepped closer, Michael's mind raced. He needed to act fast. He needed to find a way out. But before he could move, a sudden noise caught his attention. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill down his spine. It was the sound of sirens. Grayson's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. You called the police? Michael didn't respond. He didn't need to. The sound of sirens grew louder, filling the air with a sense of urgency. Grayson's expression darkened as he realized the game was up. "This isn't over," he spat, then turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. Michael didn't chase him. He stayed where he was, his chest heaving, his mind racing. As the police arrived, Michael knew this was only the beginning. The shield was still out there, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. But Michael wasn't going to back down. He had the evidence. He had the truth. And he was going to expose them no matter what it took. As he stood there, surrounded by chaos, Michael knew one thing for certain: the fight was far from over.